Well, today we're going to speak about a conspiracy. That's right. A conspiracy that involves the Melbourne Convention Trust, Victoria Police Command, and most importantly of all, the Victorian Government. And also a gutless legacy media, totally gutless. Now, over the last week or so, you may have seen the hysteria regarding a relatively small protest outside the Melbourne Convention Centre. But I don't think a lot of people understand how this all came about and how it highlights the total bankruptcy of the Victorian Labor government. The so-called arms fair or conference, which was held at the Melbourne Convention Centre last week, was nothing more than a festival for the merchants of death. Our very own Defence Minister described it as essential to protect Australians. This was nothing more than an arms fair. It gave arms manufacturers from around the world the ability to sell their armaments to a variety of state and non-state actors. And to hold such a convention or fair in the centre of a major city is not only disgusting but disgraceful. Now, just in case you're not aware, the Melbourne Convention Centre Trust is a subsidiary of the Victorian Government. The Minister for Tourism, Mr. Steve Dimopoulos, is the minister responsible for the Melbourne Convention Centre Trust. And Mr. John Brumby, a former Labor Premier, is the chairperson of that trust. The Jacinta Allen-led Labor government was fully aware of what would occur if a major arms fair was held in the centre of Melbourne. There are rumours going round, and I haven't been able to verify these at this stage, but I'm sure people with more resources than I am will, that the Victorian state government actually provided money, financial support, to these merchants of death to hold their commercial extravaganza in a Victorian-owned government centre. Interestingly, about a week before the convention was held, material was leaked to the legacy media about the tens of thousands of protesters who were going to descend on the Melbourne Convention Centre, and how important it was for the Victoria Police to protect the delegates, and how expensive it would be for the state government, between $10 to $15 million for this three-day extravaganza, where the merchants of death made extraordinary profits from signing contracts with both state and non-state actors, many of whom, or most of whom, were not known to the Australian people. So what happened? Well, the Victoria Police, the command of the Victorian Police, the current Commissioner, Mr. Patton, somehow thinks he's General Patton, you know, the extraordinary World War II US general who, was involved in the battle against the Nazis in Europe and how successful he was. But the problem is there's a huge difference between the Victorian Police Command and General Patton and his troops. The difference is that the Victoria Police Commissioner has decided to declare war on people who are going to disrupt this festival of death in the middle of the Melbourne city, in a Victorian-owned, which is you own as a citizen, and a Victorian-owned convention centre. What we saw is an extraordinary display of police overreaction and brutality, which has not been seen on the streets of Melbourne for a long time. About 1,500, not 15,000, not 50,000, but about 1,500 protesters gathered outside the Melbourne Convention Centre on the first day of this Festival of Death, which was being conducted on behalf of the merchants of death. Now, these protesters, in the main, were young, with a sprinkling of older people, retired people. They were relatively peaceful, and they were facing hundreds of not only Victoria Police, but New South Wales Police and police which had been brought down from West Australia, who used tear gas, stun grenades, rubber bullets and pepper spray to disperse the crowd. Now, obviously, people became angry at what had occurred. At the same time, let's not forget the Victoria Police Command has had a long history of creating confrontation against protest organisers and using agent provocateurs to stir up trouble to somehow justify their reaction to what was a relatively peaceful protest. On top of that, we had a gutless legacy media headed by the Murdoch press, the Channel 9 group, every commercial television station, and the gutless government guild of Australian Broadcasting Corporation reporting what happened as if it was some type of riot. We heard figures bandied about that were just difficult to believe. We saw pictures which were run over and over and over again of fires in rubbish bins. Just an extraordinary overreaction to a relatively peaceful protest. So you ask yourself why? First of all, why did the Victorian government not only agree but supported, and I have been told financially supported, not only by providing this extraordinary police presence, but financially supported the organisers of this Festival of Death, to fill up the pockets with 30 pieces of silver for the merchants of death. Why? Well, to be brutally honest, this was little more than a training program where Victoria Police Command decided to bloody the Victoria Police Force in terms of using paramilitary, that's right, paramilitary apparatus in order to disperse a relatively peaceful protest of 1,500 people, where rubber bullets, stun grenades, pepper spray, and I understand tear gas, as well as mounted police horses and hundreds of Victoria Police, were used to disperse this peaceful protest about the merchants of death in the centre of our city, the city of Melbourne, hosted, financed, promoted by the Labor state government. It really highlights how out of touch the Labor Party has become with an increasing minority and a majority of people around the country. Then we saw, as I said it before, the Defence Minister, the Federal Defence Minister, coming to the Festival of Death, shaking the hands of the merchants of death, congratulating them on their display and telling Australians all and sundry that somehow this had something to do with the defence of the country. This had nothing to do with the defence of the country. This was an armaments fair. This was a fair to allow businesses and corporations which are involved in creating weapons of destruction to be sold to a variety of actors, both state and non-state actors. It is a very, very low moment in this country's history, and especially in Victoria's history. And it is a low moment, not because of what had occurred, because this occurs with monotonous regularity around the country, but it was a low moment because of the integration of the military-industrial complex, not just in this country but internationally, the government of the day and the disciplinary arm of the state, police and armed forces, in a concerted action which treated relatively young men and women and some elderly men and women as human garbage, as disposable, as enemies of the state. But what really upset me was not the fact that the Victorian state government was involved, not the fact that the Defence Minister made his outrageous claims, not the fact that the Victoria Police Command saw itself as a military organisation and was happy to use, that's right, happy to use the samples, the 3 samples provided by the military-industrial complex, to restore so-called order. That doesn't concern me. I expect that, and you expect that. But what concerned me was the lack of reaction from our religious leaders. Where were the priests, the ministers, the rabbis, the mullahs, people who talk about peace? Where were the protests from the major churches and mosques and synagogues and temples about what was happening in the Melbourne CBD? Where was the analysis in the legacy media? I mean, I expect that type of garbage from the corporate-owned media, who basically will do anything to sell advertising in order to fill the pockets of Murdoch and Channel 9 and Channel 7. But I didn't expect this lack of analysis, even from a government-gelded Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The problem isn't a few protesters who lighted a few fires, the idiots who threw a few plastic bottles full of water at the police. The problem is the fact that we don't know how much money was provided by the Victorian government for this arms fair. The fact is we don't know who signed contracts with these private companies for these arm deals. Because these arms deals, this is an international conference. You've got actors, state and non-state actors from around the world came here to purchase arms for what particular purpose? We have no idea what contracts were signed for what purpose. And on top of that, this highlights how the legacy media especially, as well as large sections of the so-called asocial media, have no understanding of the underlying issue. The underlying issue wasn't 1,500 protesters, or two women who locked themselves to a car to block a street, or a few people who threw a few plastic bottles full of water. The underlying issue is, how could this be allowed to occur in the middle of the Melbourne CBD? How could it be hailed as a great economic initiative? How could so many members of the Victorian Labor government forget their history, forget how the Labor Party was formed, forget their responsibility? And when I go back to our religious leaders who talk about, making swords into ploughshares and promoting peace and talking about peaceful change, where were they? And I'll tell you why they're not there anymore. Because they've been bought out by contracts to provide services to the Australian people which should be provided by governments. It is an extraordinarily difficult time we find ourselves in. Not only do we have laws in this country which totally inhibit free speech. I mean, the only reason I can do this is because basically what I say is basically irrelevant. I don't have the reach of the government of the day, or the 90 or 100 media personnel which work for the Victoria Police Department, whose job it is, to try to bury any story regarding them. But more importantly, the fact that we've reached a situation where in Australia we need a militarised police force with extraordinary powers to control protest and dissent highlights how fearful those in authority are becoming because of the increasing gap between the rich and poor, because of the increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the fact that now Middle Australia finds itself in such a situation. When I started speaking, I talked about a conspiracy. Well, this is a conspiracy in terms of Victoria Police Command and the Victorian Government, and possibly other people from other states, as we saw New South Wales and West Australia Police here for this little festival of death, preparing themselves for possible pushback from those who have been ostracised, marginalised, pushed aside, ignored during the corporatisation, privatisation, deregulation and globalisation revolution which has swept not only Australia but the rest of the world.